A third way you can solve quadratic equations besides factoring and quadratic formula is completing the square. Now, unfortunately, you're going to have to memorize the process, or at least most teachers do. And so when I'm referring to A, B, and C, again, I'm referring to the fact that A is the coefficient, so it's the number in front of the x squared. B is the coefficient of the x term, and C is the constant. In other words, it does not have any x attached to it. All right, so the very, very first step when you complete the square is making sure that the leading coefficient, in other words, that A value is 1. And as we can see on this example, A is not 1, it's 2. So if it's not 1, you have to make it equal to 1. How do we do that? Well, remember this is 2 times x squared, so we can divide by 2, because 2 divided by 2 is 1. But the catch that people mess up on is the fact that you have to divide every single term by 2. Okay, so now when we simplify, we have x squared minus 10x, I'm sorry, minus 5x, just kidding. 6 divided by 2 is 3, and then 0 divided by 2 is 0, right? So now the second step for completing the square is you have to move the C value to the other side of the equation, okay? So what is the C in this particular case? It's positive 3. So how are we going to move it to the other side? Well, the opposite of adding 3 is subtracting 3. Now, this is the step where I like to put boxes, or you can leave a little bit of space. So we're going to get ready to add the exact same number on both sides of the equal sign. And then 0 minus 3 is negative 3, right? So I like to add a box on both sides. Now, let me just stop for a second and say that as long as you add the exact same number on both sides, you're not actually changing the value of the equation. I can add 100 to both sides. I can add 27 to both sides. I'm just picking any random number. But what we're going to do is we're going to we're going to add a very special number, a very specific number to both sides. And there's going to be magic that happens there. So the very first step is what is going to go in that box. So what you're going to have to memorize is you're going to cut B in half, right? So the B value. And then you're going to square it, okay? So that is going to produce us a very special scenario. But before we do that, right? So the B value is negative 5. So on your calculator, divide by 2, that's negative 2.5. And then you're going to square it, right? Squaring something means multiplying by itself twice. So negative 2.5 times a negative 2.5 is going to give us a positive 6.25. Now, I do just want to add that whenever you do this step, you better always get a positive number, because when you square a number, it's always positive. So what does this do? Now, this is what is called a perfect square trinomial. It's a trinomial, right? 3 terms, but it's called a perfect square trinomial because it's something squared, right? That's where that perfect square is. Because we're going to take the square root of that later, and what happens is whatever's inside the parentheses is going to break free, right? So the template is always going to end up being x plus or minus, depending on the problem, this box, right? So step number 3, right? That is what goes in the first set of boxes. Now, step 4 is, well, what's going to go in this box? Okay. And it's going to be connected to what we did before. So first things first, let me finish. We have to simplify the other side. Negative 3 plus 6.25 is 3.25. Okay. So now we have to figure out what goes in that box. So it's nice and easy to remember. It's actually just going to be the first step of step 3. So remember when we cut B in half, that's what goes in that box. Okay, so in here, that is going to be half of B. Okay, so now I am going to, so remember that B is negative, so this should actually change into a minus. So it's going to be minus 2.5. Okay, so I just want to say, supposedly, right? squaring something means multiplying it by itself, right? So that's the same thing as x minus 2.5 times itself. Now, I'm not going to show you here, but what's really cool is when you do the distributive property or foiling, whatever method you do, surprise, surprise, you're going to end up with that perfect square trinomial again. So we're not just doing random stuff, we're actually doing things that work. Okay, so again, you don't have to, so if you were to do it backwards, right, you could use the AC method, but you don't have to do all that work, right? So that's why there's like a template or a recipe, if you will, of completing the square that takes care of it for you. Okay, so you're just going to have to memorize the steps. So now what we have done is we have converted it from standard form to something that looks like this. Okay, so now we are so much closer to getting x by itself. So step number 5, and that's the last step, is we're going to solve using the square root method. Why is it called the square root method? Well, duh, because you're going to take the square root of both sides. Why are we going to do that? Because the opposite of squaring is square rooting, right? So when you take the square root, these that squared goes away. And what is left is what's inside the parentheses. So we have x minus 2.5. Here's the thing, though, that you have to be super careful, okay? It's such a common mistake. Whenever you solve for x and you take the square root, always, 100% of the time, you always have to have a plus or a minus sign, okay? So underneath step 5, I'll write plus or minus. You always do this, okay? So now, remember the direction says you can round to the nearest 10th. So I'm going to drop down that plus or minus sign. We'll talk about what that means. And you're just going to take the square root of 3.25 on your calculator, round it to the nearest 10th. That's going to be about 1.8. Okay, so now we are one step away, right? If we combine like terms. Now, before I do that, you can in this step, right, add 2.5 to both sides. I like to, at this point in time, remind my students, what the heck is that even saying? Well, this is saying two things, that x minus 2.5 is equal to the positive 1.8, or, you guessed it, x minus 2.5 is equal to negative 1.8. That's literally what that previous step is saying. So I like to do the split first, and then from there, right? So you were solving two completely separate equations, right? With the same steps though, right? Because we should be adding 2.5 to both sides for both of these equations. So the left side, you're doing positive 1.8 plus 2.5, and you should be getting 4.3. That's one of the solutions. And on the other side, when you add 2.5 to both sides, that's going to produce the other answer. So that is going to be 0.7. Congrats, you made it. You made it through the whole pretest. I hope this was helpful. So just a reminder, I left a link in the description. I have a whole course on all the prerequisite skills in detail, modules, lessons, homeworks, quizzes, warm-ups, stuff like that. So just as you would for a regular class. So as I said, I'll leave a link in the description onto my website, and I hope I'll see you soon.